Chapter 1. "Looking bloody good, old boy," Arthur Cholmondely-Godstone shouted. He wasn't sure if Brayman had heard. It was very windy, and the rope bridge they were perched on was swaying violently. Arthur had always had a head for heights, but he could see that Brayman was having second thoughts. "Don't you feel alive?" Arthur yelled, yanking the bungee rope which, as luck would have it, was attached at one end to Brayman. Brayman was feeling alive. He was feeling very alive, so alive that the prospect of hurling himself off the bridge began to seem a lot less appealing than it had when Arthur suggested it over lunch. At the time, and for a few hours afterwards, it had made perfect sense. It had been quite some lunch. He had never eaten such exotic food. The tastes had danced around his mouth, and much of it still lay in his stomach, barely digested. Then there was the alcohol. A whiskey to start, or was it a gin? He couldn't remember, but there was a hell of a lot to follow. But the alcohol had dissipated, and there was a stark reality emerging. There were rocks down there. "There's nothing like the adrenaline rush. It's a natural high you get when you push the boundaries." Brayman, ordinarily a mild-mannered man, turned to Arthur and said, "Then you can fucking well jump." Arthur was something of an expert at pushing boundaries, although they were invariably someone else's. "Of course. Do you want me to go first?" Arthur said, so agreeably as to disarm Brayman, who now felt guilty for his apparent rudeness and aggression. Arthur moved closer to him. "Isn't that a fantastic view?" Brayman hadn't really noticed. He was more concerned with an accident he may have had in his trousers. "Come back here and just savour it for a moment," Arthur encouraged. Brayman jumped at the chance, hoping it would be the only jump he'd make that day. He wasn't sure whether he would continue the bucket list of high-risk sports Arthur had suggested, but he was certain he wasn't going to jump off that damn bridge. The wind died, which wasn't the death that Arthur was hoping for, but it made conversation much easier. "That's it. Now take a look." Until 3 weeks ago, Brayman had never left England, but Arthur had persuaded him to fly to Victoria Falls, sandwiched between Zambia and Zimbabwe. It was quite an experience. Brayman took a look, comforted by the knowledge that he was now safe. It was a fine view. The bridge was carelessly strung across a sharp valley, at the bottom of which a river flowed over polished white rocks, forming white swirls that veered off, creating random patterns. He cast his eyes over the trees, rust-coloured with autumnal decline, but somehow colour-coded. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The view, Brayman had to admit, was beautiful. Normally, rust-coloured trees made him anxious, at least they had in his garden centre, as it rendered them unsaleable. But he no longer needed to worry about that. Good fortune had hardly ever blown his way until a property developer decided to build on the land behind him. It didn't take a genius to realise there was only one way in, and that would involve the purchase of his garden centre. And now that the money was happily invested with Arthur, he was secure for life and had nothing to worry about. "Let's just stay here for a moment, and then I'll lash myself up," Arthur said cheerily. He hunted around his pockets until he found a hip flask. He was confident he had packed at least 2. He twisted open the top and took a nip. He looked down for the first time and noted that it was, not to put too fine a point on it, a fuck of a long way. He took another nip and then offered it to Brayman. Brayman didn't take a nip, he took a swig, and then followed that with something approaching a gulp. He had grown to rather like brandy through Arthur's influence. He was still learning and keen to learn more. "Lovely brandy," he muttered. Arthur raised his eyes. It was actually a fine blended Scotch whisky. It was over 30 years old and sublimely smooth, which rendered a gulp possible when a nip would have been wiser. Much wiser, as the quality and smoothness was such that it successfully masked the fact that 80% of it was alcohol. It was, of course, fabulously expensive. "Very lovely," Brayman said again, by way of a request for more. Arthur was delighted to oblige. Brayman was beginning to see the point. The wind, the clarity of the view, the smell of the air. He had never been to Africa before. He hadn't been anywhere. Even a school trip years ago had only taken him to Blackpool. He'd never had either the time or the money. Now he had both.